Part 1. The beginning of a happy Watts family murder case is one of the most shocking cases that has deeply impacted public opinion in the U.S., not only because of the brutality of the act, but also because of the unraveling of what seemed like a perfect family. In the beginning, we'll explore the Watts family, their life before the tragedy struck, and what led to the collapse of what appeared to be a happy family. Christopher and Shanann, a seemingly happy meeting. Christopher Watts, born in 1985 in Spring Lake, North Carolina, had a rather tumultuous childhood. He grew up in a middle-class family, but no one could have predicted that Christopher would later become the central figure in one of America's most devastating murder cases. At the same time, Shanann Watts, born in 1984 in Aberdeen, North Carolina, also had her share of struggles. Unlike Christopher, Shanann came from a more stable background, and she worked hard to maintain her family and career. Despite coming from different backgrounds, they met in 2010 through an online dating app, and within a year, they decided to marry. On November 3, 2012, Christopher and Shanann officially became husband and wife in a simple ceremony in Mecklenburg County. Their wedding was filled with love and hopes for a fulfilling and happy life. From there, they began to build their home in Frederick, Colorado, a small town in Colorado. The Watts family early life together. Christopher and Shanann decided to move to Frederick in 2013, where they bought a spacious 5-bedroom house. However, from the early years of settling into their new life there, financial struggles started to surface. Although Christopher's job at Anadarko Petroleum was stable, he still faced financial pressures. Meanwhile, Shanann's career as a multi-level marketing seller with the company Lavelle, selling health products called Thrive, was not going smoothly either. While the work brought in decent income, Shanann faced fierce competition and difficulties in maintaining financial stability for her family. In 2015, a major event occurred. The Watts family had to file for bankruptcy. This was a huge shock for Shanann and Christopher, as they were faced with an uncertain future. They had to change their living habits, cut down on expenses, and live a more modest life to survive this challenging period. Despite the financial struggles, Shanann and Christopher didn't give up. They continued to work hard and dedicated themselves to their small family. Happy days and growing tensions. Despite their financial struggles, the Watts family remained happy together. They had 2 beautiful daughters, Bella and Celeste. Bella, born in 2013, was an energetic, intelligent little girl who loved her mother dearly. Celeste, born in 2015, though younger, was also a source of immense pride for both parents. Each day passed, and the Watts family seemed to grow closer. They went on trips, participated in family activities, and enjoyed joyful moments together. Shanann shared many happy pictures of her family on social media, and their life seemed like a perfect picture that anyone would envy. However, behind the happy photos on social media, the relationship between Christopher and Shanann began to show signs of tension. Financial difficulties, busy work schedules, and the pressure of raising a family caused both of them to feel strained. Shanann began to feel that Christopher was no longer as attentive to her as before. While Christopher felt overwhelmed by the pressures of married life, arguments started to rise between them, and their relationship began to fray. In fact, by 2018, Christopher had started an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessiner, a new colleague at Anadarko Petroleum. Shanann's pregnancy and the first signs of the crime. In 2018, when Shanann found out she was pregnant with their 3rd child, Nico, she was overjoyed, hoping that the baby would bring the family back to happiness. However, for Christopher, the arrival of this child did not bring joy, but instead fear and pressure. He had requested a separation and told Shanann that he no longer wanted to stay married. Although Shanann was heartbroken, she still tried to hold their family together, but their relationship was beyond repair. Meanwhile, Christopher continued his affair with Nicole Kessiner while showing no interest in Shanann. Their relationship became a silent battle, not only financially, but also emotionally and with trust issues. The changes in his behavior and his requests for a divorce were clear signs of an impending tragedy. But even as the storm of emotions was brewing, no one could have imagined that the events would culminate in such a horrific end. The warning signs before the murder. There were several warning signs of Christopher's suspicious behavior. Shanann often expressed feeling neglected and disappointed by her husband. She shared her feelings with friends and family, mentioning that she didn't feel loved and had noticed changes in Christopher's behavior. However, she never thought that these changes would lead to such a tragic outcome. Their relationship had become a silent war, not only about finances, but also about feelings and trust. Conclusion: the Watts family, once a picture-perfect family, fell into a spiral of crime that could not be undone. Although they initially seemed to be an ideal family, the unspoken tension and relationship issues slowly but surely led to a tragic and unexpected ending. This serves as a stark reminder of how domestic violence and emotional instability can manifests within families, often unnoticed until it's too late. Next, we will look into the disappearance and investigation where everything began to unfold. Part 2. The mysterious disappearance. Edith Watts' family was in the public eye for their seemingly perfect life, but on the morning of August 13, 2018, everything changed. The disappearance of Shanann Watts, along with her two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, set off a chain of events that would lead to a heartbreaking and tragic conclusion. This part of the story takes us into the tense and confusing hours leading up to the moment when Christopher Watts' world began to unravel. We will explore the disappearance of Shanann and the efforts to find her, as well as the troubling inconsistencies in Christopher's story. The day Shanann disappears on August 13, 2018, Shanann Watts returned to her home in Frederick, Colorado. After a business trip to Arizona, she had been away for a few days, and her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, had driven her home from the airport around 1:48 a.m. Nicole noticed nothing unusual at the time, and everything seemed fine. However, that would be the last time Nicole saw Shanann alive. Atkinson and Shanann had been in regular contact throughout the day. They had been talking about a doctor's appointment Shanann had scheduled for later that morning, but when the appointment time came and went without any word from Shanann, Nicole became concerned. Shanann hadn't responded to messages or phone calls. This was highly uncharacteristic of her, as Shanann was usually very communicative, especially when it came to keeping Nicole updated on her health and business matters. By early afternoon, the anxiety of Nicole turned into genuine worry. Shanann missed a business meeting she had planned, and when she didn't respond to any of Nicole's attempts to contact her, Atkinson decided to take matters into her own hands. Around 12:10 p.m., she went to the Watts home to check on Shanann. The search began when Nicole arrived at the Watts house. She found the doorbell rang and knocked, but there was no answer. She immediately grew more concerned and decided to call Christopher Watts, who had been at home with their two daughters, Bella and Celeste. That morning, Christopher was at work when Nicole reached him and told him that something was wrong. He rushed back to the house to meet Nicole. The situation quickly escalated. By the time Christopher arrived home, Nicole had already called the Frederick Police Department, fearing something might have happened to Shanann. Christopher allowed the police to search the house, but there was no sign of Shanann or the two girls. Inconsistencies in Christopher's behavior. As the police arrived and began searching the house, Christopher appeared unusually calm. There was no visible panic or distress when he was talking to the officers, or when he appeared in front of the camera. In fact, he gave an emotional plea for Shanann and the girl's safe return during a public interview, asking anyone with information to come forward. His behavior during this period raised several red flags. The police found Shanann's purse, her phone, and keys in the house. However, her car was still parked in the garage, and her wedding ring was discovered on the nightstand next to the bed. These findings indicated that Shanann had not left the house voluntarily. Yet Christopher's demeanor remained strange. There was something unsettling about the way he acted during the investigation. Meanwhile, the FBI and Colorado Bureau of Investigation (CBI) became involved in the case. They started digging deeper into the Watts' life. They soon uncovered that Shanann had been involved in a multi-level marketing business and had an online presence that seemed relatively calm and happy, while Christopher was largely absent from her posts, which became more frequent as the investigation progressed. The police's growing suspicion. The investigation quickly gained national attention, and the police were under pressure to find the missing mother and her children. But as the days passed, the search intensified, and the police began to doubt Christopher's involvement. He was the last person to see his family, yet his behavior seemed increasingly strange. On August 15, 2018, Christopher gave another interview, and in it, he insisted that he had no idea where his wife or daughters had gone. He continued to plead for their safe return, while at the same time, investigators were beginning to piece together a troubling picture of the Watts family. The polygraph test, breaking the truth after Christopher's behavior continued to raise suspicion. The police decided to administer a polygraph test, lie detector test. During the test, Christopher was asked about the whereabouts of his family and his role in their disappearance. The results were not favorable, and the polygraph suggested that Christopher was being deceptive. Faced with the mounting evidence and growing pressure, Christopher finally confessed to the crimes, admitting he had murdered Shanann in a fit of rage after she confronted him about his affair. He then went on to confess to killing Bella and Celeste after the girls witnessed him killing Shanann. What happened that morning? Christopher's confession revealed a chilling and heartbreaking chain of events. The details were gruesome. After Shanann confronted him about his infidelity and requested a separation, an argument ensued. In a fit of anger, Christopher strangled Shanann with his hands when their daughters, Bella and Celeste, walked into the room and saw what their father had done. Christopher killed them by smothering them with a blanket. In a disturbing revelation, Christopher then transported the bodies of his wife and daughters to a nearby oil field, owned by his employer, Anadarko Petroleum, where he disposed of their bodies. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave, while the bodies of Bella and Celeste were placed inside oil tanks. Christopher's motivation, an affair, and a broken marriage Ecclestore's motivation for committing such horrific acts was not just the result of a momentary emotional outburst, but rather a combination of his extramarital affair, the breakdown of his marriage, and the personal issues he had been facing. The affair with Nicole Kessinger had become a central factor in Christopher's life, and the pressure of maintaining the facade of a perfect family, while secretly planning to leave Shanann, overwhelmed him. His actions that day were calculated and brutal, and when he realized the severity of what he had done, he tried to cover up his crime, but the evidence was undeniable, and soon after his confession, law enforcement authorities recovered the bodies and began preparing for trial. Conclusion of Part 2. The disappearance of Shanann and her two daughters, Bella and Celeste, took a horrifying turn as Christopher Watts' web of lies began to unravel. What seemed like a normal family life was shattered by an unforgivable act of violence. The police investigation revealed unsettling details about the family dynamics, and Christopher's confession added a painful chapter to this already tragic story. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the legal proceedings and the sentencing of Christopher Watts, and explore the profound impact of this case on the community and the media. Part 3. The legal proceedings, and Christopher Watts' confession after the horrific murders of Shanann Watts and her two daughters, Bella and Celeste. The legal proceedings that followed would reveal disturbing details and force the public to grapple with the chilling reality of the crimes. As Christopher Watts' confession unfolded, it was clear that this was no ordinary murder case. It was the unraveling of a man's facade, a deeply flawed individual whose actions betrayed the very people who trusted him the most. In this part of the story, we will delve into the legal aspects of the case, the court proceedings, and the aftermath of Christopher Watts' confession. We will explore the reactions from Shanann's family, the public, and how justice was ultimately served for the victims. Christopher Watts' confession. The shocking details. On August 15, 2018, Christopher Watts finally admitted to the brutal killings of his wife and children. His confession came after he failed a polygraph test, which had raised serious doubts about his involvement. The police, who had been meticulously investigating the case, were already piecing together inconsistencies in Christopher's story. When faced with mounting evidence, Watts cracked, revealing the disturbing truth. The events leading up to the murder. Christopher admitted that on the morning of August 13, 2018, after Shanann confronted him about his affair with Nicole Kessinger, the argument quickly escalated. He claimed that Shanann had become angry upon learning that he wanted a divorce. He further stated that she accused him of not loving her anymore, which led to a physical confrontation. According to Christopher's confession, Shanann allegedly grabbed the girls by the neck in a fit of rage, which pushed him over the edge. In a fit of fury, Christopher strangled Shanann to death. However, that was not the end. When their daughters, Bella and Celeste, entered the room and saw their mother lifeless on the floor, Christopher killed them to prevent them from being witnesses to the murder. He smothered them with a blanket, just as he had done to Shanann, silencing their innocent cries forever. Once the murders were complete, Christopher moved the bodies to the oil field site that he worked at. Shanann's body was buried in a shallow grave, while the bodies of Bella and Celeste were placed into large oil tanks, the very tanks that were used to store crude oil. In a grotesque act of finality, he disposed of his family in a way that would make them virtually unidentifiable, hoping that the authorities would never be able to find them. The police investigation, evidence, and confession. As the investigation progressed, the police uncovered critical pieces of evidence that painted a clearer picture of what had happened. During the search for Shanann and the children, investigators discovered that Christopher Watts had been actively lying to authorities. He initially claimed to have no idea where his wife and daughters were, and even participated in multiple media interviews, pleading for their safe return. However, the evidence was starting to mount. The police discovered that Christopher had been unfaithful to Shanann and had been seeing another woman, Nicole Kessinger, for several months. The fact that he had been living a double life was a crucial factor in understanding his motives. But the most damning evidence came when Christopher's own words betrayed him. After his polygraph test, Christopher agreed to speak with law enforcement. It was during this interview that he finally confessed to the murders. His confession was chilling and devoid of any remorse. He stated that he had killed his wife in a fit of rage and had murdered his daughters out of fear they would tell the police what they had witnessed. The confessions made it clear that Christopher had planned to murder his entire family in a cold, calculated manner. He didn't just commit a crime of passion. He deliberately and methodically decided to end the lives of those closest to him. Christopher's sentencing. Justice for the victims. In November 6, 2018, Christopher Watts pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, as well as other charges including unlawful termination of pregnancy for the death of his unborn son, Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with the deceased body died in a surprising turn. The death penalty was not sought. Shanann's family expressed that they did not want any more deaths to come from the case, and they did not want the case to prolong through a lengthy trial process. Instead, Christopher Watts was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of pregnancy and 36 years for the charges related to the tampering of the bodies. The case was significant not only because of the shocking nature of the murders, but also because of the unusual circumstances surrounding the sentencing. Christopher Watts was denied the chance for parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars, without ever having the possibility of returning to society. Shanann's family, grief and struggle less aftermath of the murders, left Shanann's family devastated. Her parents, Frank and Sandra Urzuchek, were left to grapple with the brutal loss of their daughter and granddaughters. In interviews after the murders, Shanann's parents expressed the immense pain they felt. They described Shanann as a loving mother and a hardworking woman who had been devoted to her family. The loss of their daughter and 2 young grandchildren was incomprehensible. Throughout the legal proceedings, Shannann's family faced public scrutiny and constant media attention. Despite the tragic nature of the case, there were some who questioned how Shanann had failed to see the signs of her husband's infidelity and violence. This was a painful experience for her family, who continuously had to defend her character and their own emotions in the media. Shannann's family remained steadfast in their desire for justice. They chose not to pursue the death penalty for Christopher, despite the gruesome nature of his crimes, stating that they did not want to continue the cycle of violence. Their goal was to ensure that Christopher would never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. The media frenzy, public attention, and true crime phenomenon, the case garnered massive media attention, turning the Watts family murder into a sensational, true crime story. Every detail, from Christopher Watts' public interviews to the disturbing video footage from police body cameras, was dissected and analyzed by the media. The interviews with neighbors, law enforcement officers, and even Nicole Kissinger, Christopher's mistress, provided even more insight into his life and the events leading up to the murders. Several documentaries and TV specials were made about the case. One of the most notable was American Murder: The Family Next Door, released by Netflix. The documentary received widespread attention for its use of home videos, social media posts, and audio recordings to reveal the disturbing truth behind the murders. It presented a chilling and detailed account of Shannann's life, the Watts family dynamic, and the moments leading up to the brutal killings. The case also raised important questions about domestic violence, relationship breakdowns, and the psychological state of perpetrators. It prompted discussions about warning signs that might have been missed and what could have been done to prevent the murders. Conclusion of Part 3: The Legal Proceedings. Christopher Watts' confession and the media frenzy surrounding the case revealed the horrific details of the Watts family murders. Christopher's confession opened the door to understanding his motives, driven by an affair, a crumbling marriage, and a complete breakdown of his moral compass. The legal system ensured that justice was served with a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In the next part, we will delve into the long-term impact of the case on the family, the public, and the true crime phenomenon that continues to captivate audiences around the world. We will also examine how the Watts case fits into the broader narrative of domestic violence and its devastating consequences. Part 4: The Aftermath, the Watts family case and its impact. Watts family case, a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, left behind not only a community in shock, but also questions about the nature of domestic violence, the psychological state of the perpetrators, and the role of media in such high-profile cases. As Christopher Watts is sentenced to life in prison, the effects of his brutal crimes linger, especially for the surviving family members, the community, and society as a whole. In this part of the story, we will delve into the aftermath of the case, how the media handled it, and the impact on the Watts family, particularly Shannann's parents and the public's perception of the case. Shannann's family, grief, loss, and resilience when Christopher Watts admitted to the murders of his wife, Shanann, and their 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. The ripple effect was felt not only in the immediate community of Frederick, Colorado, but across the entire nation. However, the real devastation lay with Shannann's parents, Frank and Sandra Urzuchek, who were left to cope with the unimaginable grief of losing their daughter and 2 grandchildren in one horrific event. Frank and Sandra Urzuchek, who had a close relationship with Shanann, were vocal in their desire for justice. They had always seen Christopher as a son and trusted him to be the father and husband their daughter had chosen. But after the confession and the subsequent arrest, they were left to reconcile with the fact that the person they had welcomed into their family was responsible for the deaths of those they held dear, the Erzucheks were devastated by the loss. But their grief was compounded by the media's relentless coverage of the case. Frank and Sandra became the public faces of the victims' families, and with that came the constant scrutiny of their emotions, reactions, and even their own mourning process. Despite the pain they were experiencing, they found the strength to speak out for Shanann, defending her character and memory, particularly against the negative portrayals that Christopher's defense team and others tried to spread. In several interviews, Frank and Sandra emphasized that Shanann was a loving mother who dedicated her life to her family. They insisted that no one could have known that their daughter's life would end so violently, and no one had ever suspected that Christopher Watts was capable of such monstrous behavior. Their response to the media's sensational coverage of the case was both measured and emotional. They chose not to pursue the death penalty for Christopher, despite the brutal nature of the crime, because they didn't want to add further violence to an already devastating situation. In their minds, justice was not about vengeance, but about ensuring that Christopher would never be allowed to harm anyone again. Public reaction and media frenzy of Watts' family case did not only shake the community, it also triggered a nationwide conversation about domestic violence, relationship abuse, and the warning signs of a potential murderer within a family unit. What struck many people about the case was how normal the Watts family appeared to be. Before the murder, at least on the surface, Shanann, a successful saleswoman working from home, had an active online presence where she regularly posted about her family life. Christopher, meanwhile, portrayed himself as a loving and dedicated husband and father. The public's shock at the case stemmed from the fact that they could not have predicted that a man who appeared to be an ordinary family man could commit such unspeakable acts. Media outlets, eager to cover every angle of the case, were quick to label Christopher as a cold-blooded murderer and to dissect every detail of his life. His public interviews, the police body cam footage, and the eventual release of the documentary footage provided an unsettling window into the investigation and his eventual confession. It was a classic case of the true crime phenomena, media frenzy that followed every turn of the case. From the moment Shanann's disappearance was reported to Christopher's eventual confession, the case also brought to light the role of social media. In modern-day investigations, Shanann's social media presence played a pivotal role in the investigation, as police used her posts, including family photos, vacation videos, and business updates, to piece together the timeline of events leading up to her death. It's eerie to think that the happy family moments Shanann shared online were essentially the last glimpse of normalcy before the devastating murders. The Netflix documentary, American Murder: The Family Next Door, garnered widespread attention, highlighting the chilling contrast between Shanann's public persona and the horrifying truth behind her death. The documentary presented a deeply personal portrayal of Shannan's life, showing how she worked hard to create a perfect family image online, all while dealing with the strains of a crumbling marriage and a husband who was hiding his extramarital affair. Domestic violence and the warning signs. Watts family case shed light on the insidious nature of domestic violence. Before the murders, there were warning signs that Christopher Watts was not the man he presented himself to be. His affair with Nicole Kessinger, which he kept secret from Shanann, was just one sign that something was amiss. The emotional and physical abuse that Shanann may have experienced in their marriage remained largely hidden from the public eye until the investigation revealed more about their toxic relationship. While it's unclear whether Shanann was ever directly subjected to physical violence by Christopher, experts in domestic violence point out that his controlling behaviors and the emotional abuse he likely inflicted upon her could have been key factors in the escalation of violence. Many women in abusive relationships often fail to recognize the signs of control and manipulation, especially when they are wrapped up in trying to keep their family intact. The Watts case serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence is not always visible. It's not always about physical marks or bruises, but about manipulation, emotional abuse, and the psychological toll it takes on a person. Shanann may have missed the warning signs, or perhaps she didn't want to believe that her husband could hurt her or her children. In interviews with domestic violence experts, they emphasize the importance of recognizing early signs and taking proactive steps to escape abusive situations before they escalate to violence. The Watts case has become an example of how domestic violence can manifest in subtle ways, and how important it is for people to be aware of the emotional and behavioral red flags in their relationships. The legal aftermath, sentencing, and public opinion in the wake of Christopher Watts' guilty plea and sentencing. The case sparked a wider conversation about the criminal justice system, sentencing practices, and the implications of life sentences without parole. Many people wondered whether Christopher's punishment was severe enough, considering the brutal nature of his crimes. Despite the public's desire for the death penalty, Christopher was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The Rzucek family, particularly Shanann's parents, publicly stated that they did not want Christopher to be put to death because they felt it would only prolong the agony and trauma for everyone involved. They preferred to see Christopher serve a life sentence, knowing that he would never again be able to harm anyone. However, there are many who believe that the sentence wasn't enough. Some people felt that the scale of Christopher's crimes murdering his pregnant wife and two young daughters deserved a harsher punishment. Public opinion was divided on the issue of whether life without parole was sufficient or if Christopher should have faced a more severe sentence. The enduring legacy of the Watts family Cassidy Watts family case is far from over. Even after the sentencing of Christopher Watts, the case continues to have a profound effect on the community, the public, and those directly affected by the tragedy. Shanann's parents, while grappling with their loss, have become vocal advocates for domestic violence awareness and prevention. They have taken steps to honor Shanann's memory, setting up a foundation in her name to support families affected by domestic violence. The Watts case also sparked widespread discussions on the media's role in covering true crime and how families of victims are often subject to intense public scrutiny. Many people have raised concerns about the ethics of creating documentaries or films based on real-life tragedies without consulting the families involved, which raises questions about the commercialization of grief. Conclusion: apart for the Watts family murder case left an indelible mark on everyone who followed it. From the shocking confession of Christopher Watts to the emotional toll it took on Shanann's family, this case continues to affect the way we view domestic violence and psychological abuse. Shanann's family, particularly her parents, remain strong advocates for awareness and support for victims of domestic violence. In the next part, we will explore the continuing impact of this case and how the Watts family story fits into the broader conversation on domestic violence and the criminal justice system. How has this case changed the way we view the dynamics of abusive relationships? And what lessons can be learned from this tragic event? Part 5. The continuing impact and broader conversations. Watts family case has not only been a devastating personal tragedy, but has also sparked intense debates surrounding domestic violence, the role of the media, the psychology of perpetrators, and the criminal justice system. As we dive deeper into the aftermath, we'll explore the broader implications of this case, how it has affected public perceptions of domestic abuse, and the lessons it offers about emotional manipulation and warning signs of abusive relationships. The Watts case and its role in raising domestic violence awareness. The brutal murders of Shanann Watts, along with her daughters Bella and Celeste, revealed the horrifying truth about the dangers that can be hidden behind closed doors of what appears to be a happy family. While the crime itself was shocking, its broader impact was a wake-up call for society, especially concerning the prevalence of domestic violence. The Watts case has opened a conversation about the psychological abuse that often goes unnoticed in relationships, as well as the emotional manipulation that can lead to violence. Domestic violence, as the Watts case demonstrates, is not always about physical abuse. Often, it starts with emotional control and subtle manipulation that escalates over time. In the case of Christopher Watts, his secret affair with Nicole Kessner, his emotional neglect of his wife Shanann, and his efforts to control her were all signs that could have been indicators of an abusive relationship. But these signs were ignored or overlooked by those involved. Shanann, as many survivors of abuse do, may have felt trapped in a relationship, emotionally and financially dependent on her husband, unable to see the toxic dynamics developing between them. The silent pain that many women face in emotionally abusive relationships is a key lesson that emerged from this case. According to domestic violence experts, the red flags in this case were visible to anyone who looked closely enough. But Shanann, like so many others, was not fully aware of the danger she was in. This case highlights the need for early intervention and support for those in abusive relationships. Domestic violence is a cycle that can escalate over time, and recognizing the warning signs early on can save lives. In the wake of the Watts tragedy, there has been increased advocacy for domestic violence education and resources for those in abusive situations. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rzucek, have been vocal about their desire to raise awareness and help prevent future tragedies. The role of the media, sensationalism, or necessary awareness. The media's role in the Watts family case has been a subject of much debate. On one hand, the intense media coverage helped to bring the story to the forefront of public attention, making sure that the tragic loss of life was not ignored. Shanann's story was heard. Her life as a mother, a wife, and a dedicated person was portrayed in a way that resonated with many viewers who saw themselves in her. However, there is also a darker side to the media's coverage of the case. The sensationalism that often accompanies true crime stories can be disturbing. especially when it comes to re-traumatizing the surviving family members. The constant press coverage, the television specials, and the documentaries have raised questions about the ethics of exploiting real-life tragedies for entertainment. Shanann's family, particularly her parents, were traumatized by the invasive media attention. While the public's curiosity is understandable, the line between providing awareness and exploiting grief is thin. The release of the Netflix documentary, American Murder: The Family Next Door, served to make Shanann's life and death into a public spectacle, despite the family's wishes. Their zoo checks made it clear that they were never consulted about the making of the documentary, and they did not receive any compensation from it. While the documentary provided an in-depth look at the case, it also left the family feeling further victimized. This raises the important question: how much should the media be allowed to sensationalize the tales of real-life murders? Can the pursuit of public interest override the rights and wishes of those who have lost loved ones? These ethical questions surrounding the coverage of true crime cases are becoming increasingly important as more and more stories like the Watts case are being made into films, documentaries, and series. Christopher Watts and the psychology of perpetrator Celeste Watts' actions have been the subject of much psychological analysis. How could a seemingly normal, loving father commit such a heinous act? Psychologists and criminologists have spent considerable time analyzing his motives, his psyche, and the factors that might have led him to murder his own family. At first glance, Christopher appeared to be an ordinary man. He was a father, a husband, and a seemingly stable employee. However, beneath the surface, his emotional and psychological instability began to show. Experts argue that Christopher's behavior may have been a result of entitlement, narcissism, and emotional detachment. His infidelity was not just an affair. It was a disconnection from his family and a refusal to confront the emotional problems in his marriage. Christopher's ability to compartmentalize his actions also reflects a disturbing lack of empathy. According to psychologists, many perpetrators of domestic violence and other violent crimes display narcissistic tendencies, where they feel entitled to control and manipulate others without remorse. Christopher's actions demonstrated that he was willing to kill his family, to maintain control over his life, and to continue his affair, showcasing a profound disregard for human life. It is also possible that Christopher's failure to empathize with his wife and children led him to view them as obstacles in the way of his personal desires. This lack of emotional connection could have made it easier for him to commit the crime without feeling the weight of the moral or emotional consequences. Experts point out that many domestic violence perpetrators experience a gradual detachment from their victims, which makes it easier for them to carry out violent acts. In Christopher's case, the rage he felt in the moment may have been a culmination of his emotional detachment and a sense of helplessness that he couldn't control his life anymore. The Watts case is a broader reflection of society. While the Watts family case is unique in its brutality and complexity, it is also a reflection of deeper issues in society, issues related to gender dynamics, social expectations, and mental health. Christopher's actions were not just about a failed marriage or an affair. They were also indicative of broader societal problems. The pressure on men to be the provider and the emotional distance that many men are taught to adopt in relationships can contribute to psychological strain and emotional disconnection. This case serves as a reminder of how important it is to have honest, open conversations about mental health and relationship dynamics in modern society. The pressures of daily life, financial difficulties, and unresolved emotional issues can create situations where violence feels like the only escape. It's crucial to recognize the warning signs of toxic relationships and to intervene before the situation escalates. The Watts case underscores how miscommunication, emotional neglect, and unaddressed psychological issues can lead to devastating consequences. Conclusion of Part 5. The Watts family case has not only raised awareness about domestic violence, but has also sparked broader discussions about media ethics, psychological profiling, and societal expectations. The impact of the case on Shannann's family, the public, and the ongoing conversations about true crime are far-reaching. The Watts case serves as a tragic reminder of how seemingly perfect families can hide dark secrets, and how early intervention, open communication, and emotional intelligence can prevent future tragedies. This case, while horrifying, offers a unique opportunity for society to examine its approach to domestic violence and consider how we can better address the root causes of such violence in relationships. In the final part of this video, we will reflect on the long-term impact of the Watts family case on the criminal justice system and the public, as well as the lessons we can learn from this devastating tragedy. Let me know if you'd like to proceed with the next part, or if there are any changes you need. Part 5. The continuing impact and broader conversations continue. The Watts family case has been a shockwave through public consciousness, drawing attention to issues ranging from domestic violence to the ethical implications of media coverage and how society views the psychology of violent offenders. The public's fixation with true crime stories, combined with the reality of domestic abuse, makes the Watts case an important case study in both criminal justice and social awareness. In this continuation of Part 5, we'll delve deeper into the long-term impact of the Watts family tragedy, exploring its influence on social awareness about domestic violence, how it has shaped conversations in the legal and psychological fields, and how media can both harm and help in understanding such cases. The Watts case and domestic violence awareness. The murder of Shanann Watts and her two daughters, Bella and Celeste, brought to the forefront the often hidden realities of domestic violence. It wasn't just about the brutal murders, it was about how Christopher Watts' actions highlighted how domestic abuse can be hidden in plain sight. The Watts family appeared outwardly normal, a father with a stable job, a mother with her multi-level marketing business, and two young daughters who were clearly loved. But behind closed doors, things were very different. Domestic violence often manifests in subtle ways, controlling behavior, emotional abuse, and manipulation, rather than only physical violence. For years, Shanann had been a successful saleswoman, often posting about her family life and achievements on social media. From the outside, everything seemed fine. However, the reality of what was going on behind closed doors was far darker. Christopher Watts' extramarital affair and the tension it created were just the surface of a much deeper emotional issue. Shannon's increasing concerns about her marriage, coupled with her suspicions about her husband's behavior, were never fully acknowledged or addressed. Before tragedy struck, this case raises an important question. How do we, as a society, look for the warning signs of abuse in relationships? Often, it's not until the abuse becomes overt and violent that we start to take notice. Shannon's story, in particular, serves as a tragic reminder of the danger of emotional neglect, where the psychological impact of control and manipulation can be just as destructive as physical violence. The Watts case has had a profound effect on increasing domestic violence awareness in both the public and private sectors. Advocacy groups and domestic violence organizations have used the story of the Watts family to raise awareness about emotional abuse and the importance of recognizing subtle control tactics before they escalate. Conversations about abusive relationships have become more nuanced, acknowledging that psychological manipulation often goes hand in hand with physical abuse. These topics are now discussed more openly in media campaigns, training for law enforcement, and therapy settings. Furthermore, the Watts family tragedy prompted many to reflect on the importance of mental health in abusive relationships. Many victims of domestic violence are often mentally exhausted by the emotional toll of abuse, which leads to isolation and depression. In the case of Shanann, she had started therapy and opened up to her friends about the emotional strain she was under, but perhaps she felt there was no way out. As a society, recognizing the connection between mental health and domestic violence can help create a more supportive environment for those experiencing abuse. The influence of media, exploitation, or awareness. The media's role in covering the Watts case has been controversial. While it's undeniable that the coverage raised awareness about the tragic event and the issues of domestic violence, many have criticized the sensationalism surrounding it. Television documentaries, social media commentary, and the extensive coverage in newspapers and magazines have drawn widespread attention to the story. But it has also led to ethical concerns about how much attention should be given to such a deeply personal tragedy. The Netflix documentary American Murder, The Family Next Door brought an in-depth examination of Shannon's life and her family's tragedy. It featured disturbing audio recordings, home videos, and photos from Shannon's social media accounts, which made it impossible to ignore the stark contrast between the public persona of the Watts family and the horrifying reality of the crimes committed. The film captured the emotional strain, the facade of the perfect family, and the hidden life of Christopher Watts. While documentaries like this have the power to shed light on the issue of domestic violence and raise awareness about similar cases, there is a fine line between providing necessary information and exploiting the grief of the victim's family. Shannon's family was not consulted in the making of the Netflix documentary, and they were deeply upset by the way their loved ones' pain was turned into a form of public entertainment. Their Zucheks voiced their concerns that the film could further exploit their family's sorrow, and they didn't see any compensation or acknowledgement for their involvement in the film. The media also often amplifies the perpetrator's story over that of the victims, which is another ethical concern. The fascination with Christopher Watts, his public appearances, and his confession became a topic of public speculation. Shannon's life, on the other hand, was often overshadowed by the grotesque nature of the crimes and the details surrounding her husband's betrayal. Victim blaming also entered the conversation, with some questioning how Shanann could have missed the signs of her husband's infidelity. Such narratives do little to help victims of domestic violence and can instead perpetuate harmful stigmas. The ethics of media coverage in high-profile criminal cases like this have become an important topic of discussion. How much should we delve into the private lives of the victims? At what point does media coverage shift from raising awareness to sensationalizing and exploiting tragedy for profit? These are questions that need to be addressed as we continue to see true crime stories gaining popularity in the mainstream media. The psychological impact on survivors and society. While the impact on Shanann's family has been devastating, the Watts case has also highlighted the psychological toll that violent crimes leave on survivors and the community. Survivors of domestic violence often experience deep emotional scars that are difficult to heal. Shanann's family, especially her parents, continue to live with the trauma of losing not only their daughter, but also their young granddaughters. The case has shown that the psychological impact on the surviving family members is often profound and long-lasting. Christopher's daughters were innocent victims, and their deaths have left an unhealable wound in the hearts of their surviving family members. While Shanann's parents have tried to remain strong, they have become the faces of victim advocacy. They are outspoken in their desire to prevent future tragedies and offer support to families who may be going through similar experiences. They've called for better intervention and resources for families dealing with domestic violence, aiming to make sure that no other family goes through what they did. The public, meanwhile, has also been greatly affected by this case. The Watts family case fits into a broader conversation about the need for early intervention in abusive relationships. It's a harsh reminder of how domestic violence can often be hidden under the surface of a seemingly normal family life. It calls for a deeper societal recognition of the warning signs and a more proactive approach to preventing these kinds of tragedies from happening. The legal system, a wake-up call for reform. Christopher Watts' sentencing of life without parole was a final chapter in a legal process that was both swift and thorough. His admission of guilt spared the family the agony of a trial, but it also left many wondering whether the criminal justice system has enough resources to deal with the growing problem of domestic violence and the psychological factors that lead to such heinous acts. In some ways, the Watts case serves as a wake-up call for the legal system. More attention needs to be paid to the psychological profiles of perpetrators, particularly in domestic violence cases. There are many people, like Christopher Watts, who might seem outwardly normal, but who harbor violent tendencies. The justice system must be better equipped to recognize and deal with the nuances of such behavior. This may involve more training for law enforcement officers to identify signs of psychological abuse and early intervention strategies to prevent these kinds of crimes before they escalate. Conclusion of Part 5. The Watts family case has had a profound impact, not only on those directly involved, but also on society as a whole. It has sparked conversations about domestic violence, the role of the media, the psychological makeup of offenders, and the moral responsibility of the criminal justice system. The case has raised important questions about how we deal with the hidden epidemic of emotional and psychological abuse and how we as a society can better protect vulnerable individuals. In the final part of this video, we'll take a closer look at the long-term societal implications of the Watts family tragedy and how we can move forward from this tragedy with a better understanding of the signs of domestic abuse and how to prevent it. Part 6. The societal aftermath and long-term impact of the Watts case. The Watts family tragedy, while deeply personal for those involved, has had a far-reaching societal impact that stretches far beyond the small town of Frederick, Colorado. The gruesome murders of Shanann Watts and her young daughters, Bella and Celeste, committed by Christopher Watts, raised difficult questions about family dynamics, domestic violence, and the psychological impact of such crimes on both the victims' families and the public at large. This part of the story explores the long-term consequences of the Watts case, the lessons we can learn from it, and how it fits into the larger narrative of domestic violence prevention and criminal justice reform. The Watts case as a catalyst for domestic violence awareness. The Watts family tragedy was a stark reminder that domestic violence is a pervasive issue that affects millions of people each year. Although there are often many warning signs that victims may not recognize in the midst of an abusive relationship, the Watts case showed that emotional manipulation and control can be just as damaging as physical abuse, sometimes with more severe long-term consequences. In the aftermath of the killings, various advocacy groups, nonprofit organizations, and mental health professionals have used the Watts case to highlight the importance of recognizing and intervening in situations of domestic abuse. In particular, the Watts case has been used to underscore the psychological manipulation that is often overlooked in discussions about abusive relationships. Christopher Watts' actions, including his extramarital affair, emotional neglect of Shanann, and his attempt to keep up appearances despite the hidden turmoil at home, exemplify how abusers can live double lives, manipulating their victims without their knowledge. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Urzuchek, who became the vocal spokespeople for Shanann and her daughters after the tragedy, have worked tirelessly to raise awareness about domestic violence. They've been involved in advocacy efforts to ensure that the public is better informed about the psychological and emotional impact of domestic abuse, and to provide resources for victims who may be in similar situations to Shannan's. Their efforts have contributed to a growing national conversation about how we can better address domestic violence before it escalates to tragedy. This case has also highlighted the need for improved mental health care for those suffering from emotional trauma due to abusive relationships. Christopher Watts' apparent lack of remorse and the way he described the murders, as though they were a cold, calculated action rather than a crime of passion, revealed a deeper psychological issue that went unchecked. His behavior raised questions about how we identify and treat individuals who are at risk of committing acts of violence. The role of social media in shaping public perception in today's digital age. Social media plays a significant role in shaping public perception of criminal cases. In the Watts case, Shannan's active presence on platforms like Facebook and Instagram made her an easily accessible figure for the public to relate to. She shared her family's life, her business successes, and even her personal struggles. For many, Shanann seemed like the embodiment of a hardworking mother who was trying to balance her career and family life. However, after her death, the very same platforms became a means for the media to explore her life, revealing a more intimate and at times painful portrait of her existence. In the days leading up to the murders, Shanann had posted several images that showed her excitement about her pregnancy and her dedication to her family. For the public, seeing these moments juxtaposed with the horrifying reality of her murder created a deeper emotional connection to the tragedy. But as we've seen in countless other cases, the media's focus on the killer in this case, Christopher Watts, quickly shifted the attention to the murder. People became obsessed with his confession, his interviews, and his lack of emotion. As the focus shifted from the victims to the sensational details of the crime, the public's fixation on Christopher Watts and the details of his extramarital affair seemed to detract from the fact that Shanann and her daughters were victims of an emotional and psychological war that had been waged behind closed doors for years. While social media and the media at large helped raise awareness about the crime, they also served to exploit the family's grief, turning Shanann and her daughters' deaths into a spectacle. The release of the Netflix documentary, American Murder: The Family Next Door, made Shannan's life and death a global topic of discussion. But it also opened up debates about ethics in media coverage and whether such tragic events should be turned into entertainment for public consumption. Psychological impact on the survivors and the community. For the Urzuchek family, as well as the community in Frederick, the emotional toll of the murders was profound. Shannan's parents were forced to publicly confront the loss of their daughter and grandchildren, all while enduring the invasive media coverage. Every interview, every public statement, and every social media post they made became a moment for the world to scrutinize their pain. Shannan's family members have been open about how the tragedy affected their emotional and mental well-being. In the wake of the murders, they experienced trauma, grief, and anger, not just from losing their loved ones, but also from seeing the world's fixation on Christopher Watts' actions. They were subjected to public judgment as people questioned how they could have missed the signs of violence in their daughter's marriage, adding another layer of complexity to their grief. For the broader community, the Watts case raised important questions about the prevalence of domestic violence and how we can better support families at risk of violence. Many people in the area had known Christopher and Shanann. They had seen their interactions, watched their social media posts, and interacted with them in their day-to-day lives, and yet the community was left shocked, as no one had suspected the horror that was hidden behind the facade of the Watts family. This case has led many to consider how invisible the scars of domestic violence can be, and how easily abusers can hide their actions from the outside world. The Watts case and its impact on legal and criminal justice systems. One of the most significant impacts of the Watts case is the way it has affected the criminal justice system's approach to domestic violence. Christopher Watts' confession was chilling, but it also sparked conversations about how perpetrators of domestic violence are treated and understood by the law. Christopher's guilty plea allowed the case to bypass a lengthy trial, but it also raised questions about sentencing guidelines for perpetrators of domestic violence. Life sentences without the possibility of parole were handed down to Watts, but many argue that such cases require more careful consideration of the psychological factors that contribute to the crime. It's clear that domestic violence is not always a crime of passion, but often a gradual, manipulative process where perpetrators carefully plan their actions over time. In many ways, the Watts case has served as a catalyst for criminal justice reform in terms of how domestic violence cases are approached. Advocates for victims' rights have used this case as an example of how the system needs to be more proactive in preventing such crimes and more reactive in addressing the complex dynamics of abusive relationships. This case highlighted the importance of early intervention, mental health resources, and better law enforcement training to recognize and address the red flags of abuse before it escalates to violence. Conclusion of Part 6, The Legacy of the Watts. Cassidy Watts family murders have left an indelible mark on society, sparking important discussions about domestic violence, the role of the media, and the psychology of perpetrators. The tragic deaths of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts serve as a stark reminder of the dangers that can exist within families and the need for better awareness, resources, and intervention. While Christopher Watts is now serving a life sentence, the conversation about his crimes and their broader implications continues. The Erzuchek family remains steadfast in their efforts to raise awareness about the importance of domestic violence prevention and to honor the memory of their daughter and grandchildren. As we reflect on the long-term impact of this case, it's clear that the Watts family tragedy will remain a key moment in the ongoing fight to protect victims of domestic violence and ensure that no other family has to go through what they did. The lessons learned from this case will hopefully help create a society that is more aware of the warning signs of abuse and more committed to supporting victims before it's too late. Part 6, The Legacy of the Watts Case and a Wake-Up Call for Society. The Watts family case has left a profound and lasting impact on the public's understanding of domestic violence, the psychological dynamics within families, and the often hidden nature of abusive relationships. What began as a tragic and shocking event has become a poignant reminder of the importance of early intervention, emotional intelligence, and recognizing the red flags of potential violence. The brutality of the murders of Shanann Watts, her daughters Bella and Celeste, and the betrayal by Christopher Watts has led to widespread discussions about domestic abuse. This case, while unique in its horrifying nature, serves as a stark example of how domestic violence can be ignored, minimized, or overlooked until it's too late. The Watts case raised many critical questions about how society handles cases of domestic violence and how the signs of psychological manipulation and emotional abuse are often left unaddressed. The Watts case as a catalyst for change in domestic violence awareness. The case of the Watts family tragedy has undoubtedly played a role in raising awareness about domestic violence, particularly the psychological aspect of abuse. Christopher Watts' confession, revealing how he systematically and emotionally manipulated his wife, Shanann, before ultimately murdering her and their children, has helped highlight the unseen dynamics of abusive relationships. In many cases, domestic violence doesn't start with physical violence, but instead involves subtle psychological control, manipulation, and gaslighting. Shanann, though outwardly successful and active on social media, was living in a toxic marriage where emotional manipulation played a significant role. Christopher's affair and his desire to start over with another woman were hidden behind the facade of a happy family. The psychological manipulation she experienced made it hard for her to recognize the danger she was in. For many victims, this story has served as a painful lesson. Abusive relationships often don't show their true nature until it's too late. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Erzuchek, have become public advocates for raising awareness about domestic violence, particularly emotional abuse. Their pain and their journey to advocate for victims of domestic violence show the crucial need for people to recognize early signs of abuse and intervene before it escalates to violence. Their calls for resources, support, and education on the psychological components of domestic violence have resonated deeply with the public. The legacy of the Watts case goes beyond the brutal murders. It has sparked a national conversation about how society can protect vulnerable individuals and intervene in relationships where abuse may be taking place. Media's role in the Watts case, ethics, and sensationalism. Media's role in covering the Watts case has been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it helped raise public awareness about the issue of domestic violence and the psychological dynamics that can lead to such violence. The Netflix documentary, American Murder: The Family Next Door, which presented an intimate portrayal of Shanann's life and her tragic end, brought attention to these complex issues in a raw and powerful way. However, there is also a darker side to how the case was covered. The media's obsession with the grisly details of the crime, the focus on Christopher Watts as the central figure, and the release of intimate family videos and social media posts have drawn criticism for turning a real-life tragedy into a form of entertainment. Shannan's family expressed frustration that their grief was exploited for profit. While they understood the public's curiosity, they felt that their daughter's death and the deaths of her children were turned into a spectacle. The ethical questions about media coverage of such tragedies are important. At what point does reporting the facts cross the line into exploitation? Should families who have lost loved ones in such violent and public ways have the right to control how their stories are shared with the world? These questions are now central to the ongoing discussion about how true crime should be covered in the media. The psychological impact on survivors. Shanann's family. For Frank and Sandra Urzuchek, Shanann's parents, the trauma of losing their daughter and granddaughters has been immeasurable. The pain of having to publicly confront the murder of their loved ones, while also enduring intense media scrutiny, has been a heavy burden to bear. Despite the public nature of their loss, they have chosen to use their grief to fuel their advocacy work for domestic violence prevention. They have shared their journey with the public in an effort to help others who may be experiencing similar situations and to raise awareness about the early signs of abuse. Their determination to honor Shanann's memory and push for policy change has inspired many people across the country to think more deeply about the emotional toll that domestic violence has on the surviving families. In interviews, Frank and Sandra have discussed the emotional scars that continue to affect them and their efforts to turn their pain into something productive that could potentially help prevent future tragedies. The psychological toll on Shanann's family underscores the broader issue of mental health for survivors of domestic violence. Those who lose loved ones in such violent circumstances often experience a range of emotional and psychological challenges, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). The Watts case has highlighted the importance of providing mental health support to the families of victims, as they not only deal with the loss, but also the psychological and emotional aftermath of the crime. The legal aftermath, sentencing, justice, and public opinion. The legal aftermath of the Watts case has been relatively swift, with Christopher Watts pleading guilty and being sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole, despite the overwhelming evidence against him and his confession. Some members of the public felt that justice was not fully served, especially in a case as gruesome as this one. While Watts received a life sentence rather than the death penalty, the public's opinions about what is an appropriate sentence for such crimes continue to differ. The case also sparked conversations about the criminal justice system's approach to domestic violence. Some critics have argued that the justice system does not always adequately address the underlying psychological issues of perpetrators of domestic violence. Christopher Watts, as many experts pointed out, was a man deeply enmeshed in psychological turmoil, and his actions were likely the result of long-standing emotional neglect and narcissistic tendencies. The system must recognize the complexity of such cases and not simply treat them as acts of rage. Moving forward, lessons learned and societal change of Watts' case has been a catalyst for change in both the domestic violence and criminal justice sectors. It has forced society to take a closer look at how we treat emotional abuse, how we recognize signs of manipulation, and how we can better support victims. There is now more focus on early intervention and providing resources to individuals who might be experiencing emotional and psychological abuse before the situation escalates into physical violence. This tragedy has also taught us that no relationship is immune to abuse, and that signs of violence can often be hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect life. Society must work together to educate and raise awareness about the complex dynamics of abusive relationships, so that fewer people suffer the way Shanann and her daughters did. Conclusion of Part 6. The Watts family case will always serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of emotional abuse, the hidden nature of many abusive relationships, and the tragic consequences that can arise when these signs are ignored. While Christopher Watts now serves a life sentence, the real legacy of this case lies in the lessons it has taught us about domestic violence and psychological abuse. It's up to each of us to recognize the signs of abuse in our communities, to offer support to those in need, and to ensure that such tragedies are prevented in the future. The Watts family story serves as a call to action, to continue fighting for victims of domestic violence, to demand change in the criminal justice system, and to build a society where every person can feel safe and supported in their relationships. Conclusion and call to action. Thank you for watching until the end. The Watts family case is not only a heartbreaking tragedy, but also a powerful reminder of the deep issues of domestic violence that can often go unnoticed. We hope this video has given you valuable insights into the hidden dangers within relationships and the critical importance of recognizing warning signs early on to protect yourself and your loved ones. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to Room 57. Your support helps us continue to bring you in-depth analyses of compelling and thought-provoking stories. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss any future content. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to leave a comment below to share your perspective on the case, or suggest any other stories you'd like us to cover. Together, let's raise awareness about the importance of protecting those who may be at risk of domestic violence. Thank you once again for being part of the Room 57 community. Stay tuned for more videos with valuable lessons and powerful stories.